Figure it out.
Hello, this is Adam Koralik from Figured Out Productions. The following video is a video of some kind, and I hope you enjoy it. Hey guys, it's Adam here, and today we're going to be talking about these. We've got the Hyperkin Sega Genesis HDMI cable, as well as the Pound Sega Genesis HDMI cable. Full disclosure before we go into the review, this one was donated to me by Video Games New York, specifically for the purposes of review, and this one was donated directly by Pound themselves, again for the purposes of review. So I'll put a link in the description to both of their websites. You can check them out if you're interested in either of these or anything they do. I appreciate them supplying these. That said, first and foremost, without having even used these yet, I can already tell you these are not how I am ultimately going to use the Sega Genesis. These are not meant for me. They're basically consumer grade versions that are meant for the average Joe who just wants to play the Sega Genesis on a modern television and just kind of have it be easy and convenient. What these both are is plug and play cables for the Sega Genesis that allow you to use it via HDMI on a modern television. Both of them do things that are very right, and both of them do things that are, I'm going to assume, very wrong before we get into it, but we'll get back to that in the final thoughts, and if I'm wrong, I will eat crow on that. But, so here's how it works. The Sega Genesis, when it first came out in 1989, on board had RGB capabilities. Now, RGB, the easiest way to explain this would be that it's red, green, blue, but it's the color system. It's basically the way the console thinks, and it's the way the games should look. Now, in North America, we didn't have access to it, though. We had composite cables. Now, composite cables, the reason we had those is they were standard. That's just the industry standard of the time. They were included in the box. It's what we used. But composite is not RGB. It just takes the signal and goes, okay, I guess I'll do my best. And it just gives a rough approximation of it. And to put that in comparison, RGB would be like a photograph of something, exactly the way it's meant to look. And a composite would be like literally like a composite sketch. It's a drawing of the same idea. Does that make any sense? You following me? So both of these cables did the right thing, where they tap into that RGB signal that was there all the way back in 1989. Now, a lot of devices have done this. This is not a new thing. I mean, I've been doing videos on this for years. There's all sorts of scalers and adapters and high-end ones like the Framemeister and so on and so forth that do that same purpose, that job. These, however, like I said, they're consumer grade. Each of them is like, I think like $30, and they're basically meant to just kind of give you a better picture than you remember and just make it convenient and easy to use. They're kind of like the McDonald's hamburger version of it, whereas something like the Framemeister is, you know, prime rib. You see what I'm saying? Now that's not a bad thing, because it's ridiculous to think that every person's going to sit down and get a Framemeister. Sometimes you just want to plug and play. I get that. So that said, I just want to see how these things actually hold up under scrutiny and like what their issue is. So they both did something very right where they tap into RGB, and they definitely get points for that. Where they run into a problem, and this is not their fault, is that they both have scalers built in. That's a requirement. So the Sega Genesis, its original resolution is something really funky and really low. It's like 220p, something really strange like that. It's a resolution that's odd, even to the point where the Framemeister can struggle with it, the OSSC will struggle with it. They'll get the job done, but a lot of recording devices, when they try to go straight through, they're not going to work. It uses a funky resolution. Now, if for some reason they had made a cable that was just, hey, one end is Genesis and the other end is HDMI, and there's nothing in between, your TV would not be able to understand it, because an HDMI port generally will not support any resolution below 480p. Which means it wouldn't do anything. So at the very least, they had to put a scaler in it so that it will stretch to a resolution your TV will understand. So each one did exactly that. They have a little box in the center, and that is a scaler. Now, that's where they run into a problem, because even though they've taken the RGB signal, the scaler introduces all sorts of potential issues. I'm not saying they have those issues, I'm saying it introduces potential issues. The scaler has to take that original signal and just stretch it to do something so that the television will understand it. In the case of the Hyperkin cable, it very specifically denotes on the box that it does this at 720p. I assume the Pound cable does exactly the same thing, because 720p is a very standard resolution for modern televisions to understand. In layman's terms, it just means it has to do some stuff and then it works. But the stuff that it does can introduce additional issues, depending on the quality of the scaler. Now, the quality of the scaler could mean that it creates color issues. It could create brightness issues. It can create, obviously it has to stretch. So depending on how well they did that, it could stretch very well and very clean, or it can do it very poorly. I'm betting it did it poorly only because, again, these are very consumer grade. They're $30 a piece or so, whereas a good one like the Framemeister is $400. So I'm not saying that's their fault. Their whole goal was to keep the budget down just to make it easy. These are not meant for people who care that much about it. They're meant for people who just want to plug and play and go for it. I am curious ultimately how that will play out. Now, the other issue they would introduce, and to Hyperkin's credit, they actually did fix this one. Because 720p is a widescreen resolution, and the Sega Genesis did not display in widescreen, it displayed in 4:3, the scaler that they produced will stretch the image unnaturally wide. The Hyperkin cable actually has a switch on it that lets you fix that. It can go from 16:9, which is wrong, to 4:3, which is correct. So to their credit, they get a point there. They did actually fix that. The Pound cable did not do that, but to the Pound cable's credit, they mention a greater variety of compatibility with different platforms, which is also very interesting. Both of these cables mention very specifically they function with the Sega Genesis Model 1, 2, and 3. Now that's interesting. First of all, that the Genesis 3 would even be mentioned is cool. But the Genesis 1 and 2 use different pinouts. So in order to have this cable support both of them, you literally have to include an adapter that will make it fit. And both of them did that, which is awesome. Now, the Pound cable also actually mentions Mega Drive specifically, and that makes sense because every Genesis cable I've ever had never really had a problem with different versions. I've got Japanese consoles, European consoles, North American consoles, and the same cables always worked. So I imagine that's exactly the same situation, but to Pound's credit, they actually thought to mention it and acknowledge it, that this works on Pound, or works on the Mega Drives, and this one does not mention that. But the other thing that neither of them mentions, and I'm actually quite curious to test, is if it works with other things. Neither of them mention the 32X, which is kind of strange. Not that the 32X was a great big success, but anyone who uses the Genesis a lot and is trying to push it will tell you a 32X, even if you don't care about the 32X library, is a nice little bonus feature to help it get better video quality out of the Sega Genesis because it doesn't suffer from rainbow banding issues, unlike the actual Genesis. So it can, while it can be a minor difference, the fact that it does it at all is a perk. That, and of course it would also give you access to the 32X library. The Sega CD library is a given since the video output comes from the Genesis either way, or the 32X if you have that. But I'm also curious what other platforms it might function with. In theory, it should function, both of them should function with the Sega CDX. They use the same pinout as a Genesis Model 2, and the JVC XI as well. I can tell you right here and now that it definitely will not work with a Pioneer Laser Active because that did not have the proprietary port on it. It also will definitely not work with the Sega Wonder Mega, which again did not have that same proprietary port on it. The other one though that they don't mention, and it's legitimately surprising, is the Sega Master System. The Sega Master System used RGB. It used the exact same pinout as a Genesis Model 1. So in theory, these both should function as HDMI cables for a Sega Master System. So I'm very curious to try that out and just see how these things ultimately perform. Let's actually go ahead and open it up and take a look at each one. So inside the Pound cable, they've got it in a Ziploc bag. Interestingly, when I talked to both, I think Pound is run by a guy named Danny, and Video Games New York, this has to be more confusing, Video Games New York is run by a guy named Dan, so we have Dan and Danny. Dan did not make this cable, but he did tell me that the engineers at Hyperkin were getting a little annoyed that a lot of their stuff is kind of associated with frankly not being that great. So they actually put a lot of effort into this one. So I'm curious. I mean, they somewhat proved themselves by including the aspect ratio adjustment, which, by the way, you can also do on your television, or if you have something like the M Classic, that will take care of it for you. But I seriously give them massive props for including that, because they are addressing a serious issue. And then Pound, on the other hand, they actually emailed me. I talked to Danny specifically, and he was like, yeah, so after the Super Nintendo cable and a lot of the feedback we've gotten on other cables, we really put our A game into this one. So like I said, to their credit, they had it support multiple platforms. They mention a lot of them, and they use the true RGB modes, which they make very clear on the back. So we will see how that plays out. But inside, they include an HDMI cable. They include the primary box part, which has the Genesis Model 2 pinout on it. They include the adapter for Genesis Model 1, and then they include the USB power supply. So the Pound cable specifically does require a power supply. Unfortunately, the Genesis itself does not have USB ports on it, so you'll have to plug this into something external, whether it's a powered-up other console like an Xbox One or whatever. I don't typically recommend using the Nintendo Switch because the voltage on that is slightly different, and that can cause issues. So in general, this is just general advice, don't use your Nintendo Switch to power other things that are not Nintendo Switch related. That's just pro tip. But overall, it looks like the same usual type of Pound cable. There's a micro USB port on the side where that goes, and so you have all that stuff. The Hyperkin cable, on the other hand, we'll open it up here. Inside, there's a little like warranty card or whatever, that doesn't really matter. And then we have the actual bulk of the device here. Inside that, we have also a USB cable for power, and then we have the dongle bit, which, okay, so Hyperkin loses a point here in my opinion. While they have the 4x3, 16x9 little toggle thing there, I like that. They've also hardwired this thing together. I don't like that. I gotta give Pound credit there. Having a detachable detachable HDMI cable is better in case anything goes wrong with the cable itself. If you want to replace it with something like the M Classic or the M cable or any of that kind of stuff, other options. You have more options with this, and I like that. But that said, they seem like the typical designs that you would get out of, you know, Hyperkin and Pound stuff. Okay, so I've been using both of these for a while, and it's time for final thoughts. Now, interestingly, upon testing both of them, I realized that both of them, so as I mentioned, they both have a scaler inside of them, right? So when you power them up and connect them to a TV, even if the Genesis isn't on, you get a screen. This is the screen from the Hyperkin cable. It just says no signal, which would be to be expected. There's nothing on. Now, interestingly, I tried exactly the same test with the Pound cable, and this was what came up. It's exactly the same, which leads me to believe that they're using exactly the same scaler in each one of these things. One might have stole it from the other, I don't know, but that basically means that these things are essentially identical. As far as I could tell, that appears to be true, except for like the little cosmetic features and stuff like that, which I kind of talked about, but we'll do a bit more in a second. But let's talk about the video quality that ultimately results from either one of these things. This is, we'll just look at some footage right now. This is, first up, this is the Hyperkin cable just running stock. This is, I chose Mighty Morphin Power Rangers for the Sega Genesis. Very colorful game, but also one of my childhood favorites. In my opinion, the colors are kind of washed out. They're better, certainly better than like composite cables, obviously, but it's just, it's not great. Which was kind of to be expected. And then if you want to compare it, of course you do, to the Pound cable, this is the Pound cable running under the exact same situation, just direct feed going. And it's noticeably brighter than the Hyperkin cable is. Like I said, with the Hyperkin cable, it was kind of like the colors weren't quite right. It was perhaps even a little dark. The Pound cable seems to be a bit the opposite. It's like the colors still aren't quite right, but now it's like too bright. And while I think they might be using the same scaler, I think that Pound might have tinkered with it a little bit more just to produce a brighter image, because brighter is more attractive, but at the same time it does look kind of washed out. Now the Framemeister is noticeably different, but is it like worth the price difference? That's really up to you to decide. You know, I'm not in a position to tell anyone what they should be doing. I can tell you, though, that the Framemeister is objectively better. It's just a matter of, is the price important to you? And I'm sure it is to a lot of people. So I also decided, just kind of for the hell of it, let's connect all these things to the M Classic and see what the difference is. So rolling back around to the Pound cable, I'm sorry, the Hyperkin cable. This is the Hyperkin cable running with the M Classic. The effect it has on it is that it, you know, buffs out the edges. It does kind of enhance the colors a little bit, upscales the resolution and all that kind of stuff. But nothing amazing, nothing, you know, night and day or anything like that. It is different, but that's to be expected. And then I did the exact same thing over here when I took the Pound cable. Now the Pound cable running with the M Classic, and as to be expected, it is, you know, more buffed out and it looks a little cleaner. Colors are improved a bit, but it's still, you know, got that brightness thing. And again, this is basically the same on the television as it is with the Hyperkin cable. The issue is, to some extent, the recording device. Don't forget, when you're looking at this stuff, you are looking at captured footage that has had to be compressed and edited and re-uploaded to YouTube, and that does affect it. But in general, it seems like the Pound version is just a tad brighter. So when you fire up the Framemeister and then do that, that's when you see more of a difference between the two. This is, you know, some people like the way the Framemeister looks on its own, other people like it with the M Classic. You know, it depends on the console, honestly. I like the color effects that the M Classic gives to the Framemeister version, but not necessarily the buffing at all times. But that doesn't really matter because we're not really here to talk about that. We're here to talk about these two cables. So I hope that gives you a good sense of it. So if you're thinking like, what is the difference between the two, like which one is better? The thing is, I noticed a couple of odd things. First, I want to give Pound credit here because I kind of chastised them for this earlier in the video and then realized I was wrong. So the Hyperkin cable has that switch on it, right? That goes from 4x3 to 16x9, whereas the Pound cable doesn't. So my assumption was that, okay, great, they're going to make me fix it on the TV like they did with the PlayStation 2. Other way around. They've actually got this thing hard-coded to always be in the 4x3 mode. They don't give you the choice of 16x9. So this thing actually pre-adjusts the aspect ratio and corrects the problem for you. So I actually like that. I think that that was a good move. Now, you can kind of look at that one of two ways. You can look at it as Hyperkin gave you more choices, or you can look at it as Hyperkin gave the potential to do it wrong, whereas Pound at least didn't have that problem. So you can look at it either way. But I like that about the Pound cable. The other thing I prefer about the Pound cable, and I mentioned it before, is that it's not hardwired, it's in detached pieces. This is useful, again, because if you want to swap out your own cable, you can do that. It reduces the probability of it breaking because, again, if the HDMI cord part of this cable breaks, the whole thing is junk, whereas with that, you can at least swap it out. It also, personally, made recording footage much easier for me because of the fact that you're not hardwired to this thing. You can swap out any set. You can also add things like the M Classic or the M Cable relatively easily, whereas with this you either need a female to female HDMI coupler or you need an HDMI switch, and you have to go through that whole process. So between the two, I would say the Pound cable is the better of the two. For basically exactly the same price and basically the exact same content. That's not really surprising, I suppose. The other thing that was interesting about both of them, I mentioned before that I wanted to try it with all these devices, not just the ones they list. They all work with every version of the Genesis as stated. They work with every version of the Mega Drive as stated. They do work with the Sega CDX. They do work with the JVC XI. And they do work with the Sega Master System. I can get why they put the compatibility thing here, right? And I can get why they didn't list the obscure things like the JVC XI. But the Sega Master System is an entirely different console. It is just kind of odd that they didn't put that on the box because it actually looked pretty good. Again, not Framemeister good, but good. So it seems like a weird oversight. But then again, these are targeted towards a North American demographic, and the North American demographic rarely cares about Master System. But I mean, we're talking about just a little bit of white text on the box, and you're good to go. So if you're in the European market and you're like, hey, I want to use my Master System, you could do worse than these. When it comes to latency and lag, I was playing fighting games. I didn't really have any problems with that. I'm sure some people will argue that that exists, and it wouldn't surprise me. I can't imagine the scaler in these things is, I mean, we know is not the best, but at least from the basic gameplay that I was doing, I really didn't encounter any issues like that. So there you go. If you're interested in either one of these, I'll put the links in the description again to Pound and to Hyperkin, specifically Video Games New York, if you want to order either of them. Thank you guys very much for watching. If you could like, comment, subscribe, check out all the social media stuff, Instagram, Twitter, Facebook, all that. I appreciate it. Patreon's in there as well. Thank you very much. Again, thank you to Video Games New York. Thank you to Pound. Thank you for watching. I'll see you all later.